Hey everyone, so my name is David Mainville. I'm one of the co-founders here at Navvia. Just a little bit about my background. I've got over 35 years of information technology and business process management experience. I actually started off as a mainframe technician, did a lot of work in the IT service management space, became a process consultant, did a variety of work as a systems management architect. And about 20 years ago, in 1999, I was the co-founder of Navvia. Navvia started out as a business process consultancy, and we worked with very large organizations around North America, the New York Stock Exchange, Coca-Cola, Staples, Bank of New York Mellon, and we helped them design and implement processes, not only the process design, but also the implementation of the process in various process automation tools. As the co-founder of Navvia, I took our consulting company, and along with our team, of course, and we took it from a brick and mortar process improvement consultancy to a software company delivering an innovative SaaS business process analysis tool. This is just one last slide on our company. That tool is the Navvia Process Designer. We actually built the Navvia Process Designer as a way to improve the delivery of our services to our clients. And over time, we realized that we could make this a commercial offering. So about 6 years ago, we left the consulting world altogether and have focused solely on our software product, which is the Navvia Process Designer. Before we actually get into the webinar, I'd like to just ask the audience a question, and that question relates to your level of experience in respect to user story mapping. So Catherine, if you could launch that poll, please. So I'll give everyone maybe 30, 40 seconds to answer. So we've got some answers coming in. Catherine, could you see the responses as they're coming in, or is it just me that sees them?
Yeah, I can see some responses getting in.
Oh, okay. So it looks like we've got about 70%. We just need a few more responses. Got about 75, 76%. I'll let it go another 10 seconds or so as people respond. And right, why don't we go ahead and for the sake of time, shut down the poll. So the responses basically a nice balance. About 10% say they are very experienced and use user story mapping all the time on projects. That's great. Knowledgeable and use it intermittently on projects came in at about 33%. Knowledgeable but haven't used it on any project is about 20%. And it looks like 38% of the respondents are just learning about user story mapping. So a nice balance of people from all aspects. So let's stop sharing that. Oh, I guess I could share that. Yeah, let me go out of here. Sorry about that. So let's get into the presentation. So stories. I want to sort of put the context of this presentation today into the importance of stories. Storytelling is universal, and it's something as ancient as humankind. Before there was writing, there was storytelling. It occurs in every culture and at every age to entertain and to inform. Stories help pass on customs, knowledge, and ideas. As a matter of fact, I think it's just intrinsic to the human condition. It's something that we all experience, from telling stories to our children to telling stories about what we've done on the weekend. It's just the way we communicate as people. So what does this have to do with user stories? Well, I really see user stories as the key to unlocking understanding. And you do that by forming a dialogue with your users. So you really get a sense of what people are looking for, how they want to use an application. You get a sense of what's important to them in the features that are going to be rolled out. Now, one of the things that's important to note is that user stories are not technical requirements. You know, when we were in a consulting company, we implemented process automation tools. And during that time, I saw so many examples of stories being reverse engineered from a tool's technical capability. So rather than going out and meeting with people and understanding what they wanted, it was like the developers, not the developers so much, but the business analysts were checking a box saying, well, I have to have user stories. What is it that the tool does? And I'll reverse engineer the story. And that really doesn't help you get anywhere. I mean, yeah, you check the box, but you're not really learning anything about the particular users that are trying to, that you're trying to service with the products that you're developing. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever read this book, Start with the Why, from Simon Sinek, but this is a great book. And I think it really speaks to the importance of user stories from the perspective of user stories tell why you want to do something. Simon Sinek goes on to talk about how understanding the why is the first step in inspiring greatness. So for example, he says in his book, when JFK went on to say, and I think I'm paraphrasing here, but JFK said in one of his most famous speeches, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and to do other things, not because they're easy, but because they are hard. And this inspired a generation of scientists and engineers that propelled our society forward. And to a lesser, but equally important degree, user stories should inspire us to build better products and set that, products that satisfy or exceed the needs of the users. So I'm going to just throw this out to the audience. What is the first word that comes to mind when you think of user stories? Just throw some of it into the chat, and I'll feed some of those responses back to everybody. So what's the first word that comes to mind? Tool, okay, there's one. What other words come to mind when you think of user stories? Wants, yes, that's very good. Thank you, Nick, thank you. Anybody else? Benefits, agile, user experience, value, the why. Yeah, these are all great things. These are fabulous. Everything that's being said by the audience, solution, all these things are definitely true. But to me, the first word that comes to mind when I think of user stories is empathy. Now, why do I think empathy? Well, a couple of years ago, I took a course in design thinking. And in the first class, the lecturer played a video that was filmed in a hospital. And in this video, we got to see various people. There was a mother obviously waiting for her child to come out of surgery. There was a distressed man. I think, you got the sense that he received some pretty bad news. You saw a frustrated, overworked nurse. And the point of this video was to remind us that when we build solutions, we're building solutions for real people. People with feelings, people with needs, people who have problems that need solving. And when we're building these solutions, we really need to understand the various perspectives of the very diverse community that we're trying to deliver solutions for. Maybe there's salespeople on the road, so they need something that works very well in a mobile environment. Or there could be agents serving customers who have a lot of pressure and a lot of turnover and a lot of high demand. Or you have customers placing orders, or the staff in Amazon who's picking orders off the shelf. How can we make their lives just a little bit easier? And I think we do that by understanding their point of view and their perspective, by opening up that dialogue I spoke about earlier through user stories. Again, user stories are not technical requirements. They're the requirements of the users put forth in very human terms. Here's an example of something I got from a software company by the name of Topdesk. And this was something that was in their blog. They have a great toolkit on customer journey mapping. And customer journey mapping is, quite frankly, related to user stories. And this is just one of the tools that they use, that they provided as part of the blog. And when you get the video, these hyperlinks will work, so you'll be able to go out and get access to the materials yourselves. So here we have Vera. She's 28 years old. She's a human resources person. She's an associate level in the HR department. Her typical work week is made up of these things. She has certain goals, certain frustrations, and certain characteristics. So by going out and understanding all the various people within the organization who your solution is going to serve, you're in a much better situation of empathizing and providing solutions that are going to meet their specific needs, not assuming you understand their needs, but really going out and learning about their needs. Now, a user story has a standard structure. So let's go through that structure just as a reminder. So as a persona, so that could be Vera that we just talked about, I need a certain capability. So she might need easy access to, or a quick way to upload, or whatever those capabilities are that satisfies some of her frustrations. And you typically also associate a benefit. So as a persona, I need this, so I receive a very specific benefit. Now I'm going to give you an example of a user story that relates to an experience that I just went through very, very recently, just last Tuesday, as a matter of fact. So as a valued client, I want the most inconvenient and complex method of placing an order. Why? Because I have plenty of time to waste. Now, of course, I'm joking here, right? But doesn't it feel like sometimes this is exactly what happens in your own life? You know, that you go to use a specific piece of software or a tool, and you just spend more time trying to figure out how to use it than actually solving the problem that you're trying to achieve. Now, I also want to mention that when it comes to user stories, acceptance criteria is another piece that's associated. And acceptance criteria is really essential for validation and testing once a solution has been implemented, because then you can test from the perspective of a particular user that the criteria that they were looking for has actually been met in the product. Now, I'm going to give you a real life example of something that happened last Tuesday, which was the sort of the genesis of that, you know, user story that I put forth. So I had to go up to a government website to download proof of vaccination. So I went up to, you know, it was like the day before that we were required to do that. So the day before, I went to the website, and this is what I got. PDF is being prepared for you to download. Your number in line, 183,244. Number of users ahead of you, 20,961. Your estimated wait time is 11 minutes. Well, I'm as impatient as the next person, so I decided, okay, I'll leave that running and I'll go off and do some other work. And then I remembered, hey, I better go back and see where I am. And this was the next message I got. Oops, sorry, something went wrong. So it appeared that if I wasn't there when my virtual queue came up in line, I lost my session and I had to do this all over again. Well, I went through this twice before, you know, I learned quickly, right? I went through this twice before I realized I'm not going to do this. And as a matter of fact, each time I did it, the wait time was longer. So I said, you know, enough of this, right? But wait, there's more. So I decided, you know, rather than try to do this in the daytime, I'll do it later on that evening so that I can, you know, again, get this proof of, you know, this proof of vaccination thing out of the way. So I went to the site and I got this message. We'll be back soon. Now, remember, this is the day before there was a government mandate. We'll be back soon. Apologize for the inconvenience. We have some standard maintenance happening. Now, if any of you out there are IT service management people, I think you'd see this as what we would call a change collision, right? You shouldn't be rolling out something really important and then do maintenance at the same time. So this was an extremely frustrating experience. I mean, how would you rate this experience? And this is really, thank you, Gabrielle. I'm glad you feel for me on this. And it was frustrating, right? And that's where that kind of, you know, wow. I mean, I don't have time to waste. I don't have time to go back 3 times. You know, this is just an overall frustrating experience. I can give you dozens more examples from my life, and I'm sure each and every one of you can come up with similar examples. So, you know, we have to look at, and you know what? I can almost empathize with the IT people. They're probably under some pressure to get a solution out. So the user story was, how do I, as an IT person, get the solution out as quickly as possible? You know, I don't know if that's the way they should have been looking at it. And again, just an example of the choices we make as developers and business analysts and the various roles that are on this call today, the decisions we make can very well affect the user community, the success of the application, the success of your digital transformation initiative. So I want to spend a moment talking about a concept known as design thinking. So I took a course in design thinking a couple of years ago, and it has a really good application to software development. So what is design thinking? Well, design thinking is a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of the people, the possibilities of the technology, and the requirements for business success, underlying business success. Now, it goes way back. It's based on psychological research going all the way back to the 60s. And it really came to prominence, I guess, in the 1980s and 90s. And it's even more popular today. It's has value in every sector, whether you're building the next evolution of a fancy toaster, and there are some fancy toasters out there, I've seen a few, or you're building the next great software application. The design firm IDEO is often, thought about or mentioned as a leader in this design thinking approach, and companies as diverse as IBM, Toyota, Apple, Microsoft, Samsung, Pepsi, PepsiCo, Nike, they're all proponents of the design thinking approach. Now, design thinking, and this is where the tie into user stories comes in. Design thinking says you need to start any development initiative, whether that's for a physical product or a software product, with understanding what is the problem you're trying to solve. And to do that, you have to start by empathizing with the particular user community. So if you're designing a healthcare application, you might have to look at what are the concerns, the wants, the needs, the desires of that community. And by looking at those needs, wants, and desires, you can begin to define the problem that you're trying to solve. Oh, we need to make it easier to register for, blood work or whatever that might be. You can define what the problem is. And that drives the understanding. So the first step in design thinking, understand the problem that you're trying to solve. You can't understand it unless you speak to the people who are basically impacted by those designs. This dialogue fostered through user stories really helps promote the understanding. The next step is the explore phase. So once you have a good understanding, you can ideate, meaning come up with creative solutions for the problem, and then build some prototypes, which you can demonstrate back to the user community to say, does this meet your needs? And user stories can be refined throughout this explore phase, because as you're learning more through the ideation, you might want to tweak some of these stories or develop new user stories because you've presented the application back to the users and you've got some additional feedback. So the explore phase is all about coming up with the ideas to solve the problem and prototyping potential solutions. The next phase of the design thinking is materialization. So how do we bring this solution to market? And you do that through testing and ultimately the implementation of the solution. And user stories, and more importantly, the associated acceptance criteria are critical throughout this materialization phase, because you can use the user stories and acceptance criteria to validate that your solution is meeting the needs that you uncovered during the understanding phase. Now, when you look at design thinking as a whole, understand, explore, and materialize, I don't want to give you the impression this is a waterfall approach. This isn't sequential. This is very interactive. Understanding leads to exploration. Exploration might require you to do more understanding. Once you do the exploration, you start materializing, but then what you learn during test and implementation might come back and say, we have to, things aren't working quite the way we want, and we have to explore or understand things a little bit better. So all of this here really works as an interactive approach. So now that we've discussed a little bit of background on what user stories are, what is user story mapping and why is it important, and what value can user story mapping provide to an organization? So some of you might be familiar with the book User Story Mapping. The book's actually entitled User Story Mapping, discover the whole story and build the right product. And it's by Jeff Patton, who's a noted software developer. A great book. It's available, everywhere that books are available. And I actually took this graphic from his book. Again, the link actually links out to the book. And this shows, how you need to map out your user stories against the steps in the process. So let me show you a little more interactive example of how this user story mapping works. So let's say you're user story mapping an employee expense application. And this is a very simple example, but I think it'll give you the idea. So you might look at this employee expense application as having a number of steps: completing an expense form, submitting an expense form, somebody reviewing, approving, submitting for payment, making sure that none of the expense policies have been broken, and to ultimately reimburse the employee. And there are personas here. So back to that whole persona thing. We've got an employee with their needs and wants. We got a manager with their needs and wants. We got the finance department with their needs and wants. So once you've mapped out what the steps are and who the different personas are, you can start getting into the details. And you can start building your user stories for each and every step in the process. Now, you might find as you're building this out, you have a user story gap. So we have here, very obvious when you map them out, I don't have any user stories for approving employee expenses. Now, is that an omission, or did we capture that in other stories that came before or come after? But visually, I can see right here, I don't have user stories for that specific persona and that specific step in the process. I can also see here, I have absolutely no user stories for the finance department. We've completely left them out of the equation, whether that was intentional or by accident. We can't really see what these are. We do have a question coming in from an anonymous attendee, how to connect user stories to use cases. I see there's a lot of synergy. They're almost a synonym for each other in a sense. The user story and the acceptance criteria is kind of the use case. So if the user story is I need a simple way to upload my expense report, and the acceptance criteria outlines how that's done, that becomes in essence the use case for these various steps in the process. So thank you for that question. But basically here from the mapping experience, you can see there are gaps. The other thing you can do with user story mapping is begin to take these various user stories and chop them up into different releases. So you might say that these are the user stories that give you your minimum viable product. So we have to get these out first. And then in a subsequent release, we can address some additional user stories, which might provide additional functionality or the nice to haves. So in the mapping, you not only have user stories for each and every step in the process, but you can also see release 1, release 2. You begin to prioritize the different use cases or user stories and be able to deal with those. Now, a lot of people, there's a lot of tools, right? So there's various software products on the market today. Some as simple as a Kanban board. We use a variety of products, but I've used for project management, I've used a product called Asana. And Asana gives you very nice Kanban boards, and you can sort of emulate this in there. But there's also a lot of robust products specifically built to solve the problem of user story mapping. But many people, they use this tactile approach of sticky notes on a boardroom wall. And then when I said, and this is actually used quite a bit. And when I saw this approach, so you have a bunch of, you have some people from the business and some users and some developers, and you're up there doing all of this work. When I saw this sticky note approach, it reminded me of something from my past. And back in 2006, I was a process consultant. We were working at a very large financial services firm, and we were building processes for a new subsidiary of this financial services firm. And we documented all of these processes. Back in the day, that was in Visio, and then we blew them up on big poster boards, and we had them circumnavigating the entire boardroom. We were able to interconnect the relationships because processes live in a network, really. One process can feed another. We interconnected them with strings, and so we could see visually the interconnections. And then we also use sticky notes to, if we realized we made some mistakes or we wanted to enhance or improve, we use sticky notes. So we did a very similar thing from a business process management perspective that people use from this user story mapping. And when thinking about that, a light bulb went on my head. What if we could combine user story mapping with business process mapping to drive technical requirements? And actually, I think that's a better approach. If you take it from the perspective of like the whole end to end, why do we do development work? Well, we're doing development work to meet a certain set or to deliver a certain set of outcomes for the business. Improving services, modernizing services, inventing all new services. So we have these business outcomes. And the business outcomes are typically translated in an organization through a set of operational processes. So we, if it's a call center, we have the call center processes. If it's a, an order center, we have the order processes. So we have a set of business outcomes that tend to be basically communicated in the form of processes. What if you took user stories and mapped them directly to the business processes that have been set forth? And take those user stories and say, how do these user stories actually fit into the business process? And use that to drive the technical implementation. So internally, we call that process-driven user stories. So rather than having a development team document the process in a series of steps like we did in the user story mapping, why not go back to the real source, the business process that's probably already been developed, documented, and communicated, and use the business process to drive these technical solutions. So let me give you an example of that. So let's say we go back to that same user expense application. So we start by building out the process. So the employee submits an expense form. The manager either approves or not the expense form. The manager submits it for payment. And then obviously the employee ultimately gets reimbursed. So that's the business process. Now there's a number of developers here on the line, I'm sure. Is that enough information for you to build out an application? Of course not, right? Give this to 3 developers, it'll be implemented 3 different ways because there's not enough detail here. So the next step is you talk about the user stories. So if you were to develop a user story for each and every step, for example, the employee needs a simple and time-saving method for capturing expenses and attaching receipts. Now, each step in the process can have more than one user story. You might have one in this case of capturing the expenses and receipts, one for submitting. So you have multiple user stories or use cases, if you will, that the persona, in this case, the employee, has to deal with to get this particular step in the process done. And you can then map out these user stories. Again, user story mapping, you can map out the user stories, but not to some steps that were formulated by the development side of the house, but actually was driven from the business side of the house, from the business process. So you can have all your user stories from the business process. And then for each user story, you can drive out very specific technical requirements. For example, I want to be able to scan my receipts and attach them to an expense form. I want to place these specific fields on the expense form, like the name of the employee and the different expense types. I want to create an expense report number. I want to send notifications to my manager once it's been submitted. I need to change the status of this expense report from draft mode to submitted and ultimately to paid. So now you have a much more detailed understanding of what needs to be done to develop a solution. From the step of the process to the multiple user stories that support that step, down to the detailed technical requirements that will help you deliver it. So let's see what the benefits are of this. So the benefit of this kind of approach is simultaneously you're creating the process documentation, which is really how people have to operate. Basically the instructions, the work instructions, the procedures, the processes that people have to perform. And driven from that are the actual technical requirements, user stories and requirements to implement, which will in turn drive a much better implementation. I'll give you another story from my past. And this is a real life example. So I was working for a large services firm. We were hired to help with a project to deploy new bank technology. So this bank was basically refreshing 5,000 branches right across the country. And they were basically updating the ATMs, they were updating the terminals, they were everything down to furniture, electrical, floor layout, signage. I mean, there was a lot involved in this process. And they were building all of the, what we called then the move, add, change processes for managing all of this technology, all of the assets, and ensuring that we're rolling out the new systems, the new technology in a good way. So I was part of the team who did all of the discovery work, the process workshops. We went out to branches themselves and looked at the layouts. We spoke to branch managers. We spoke to all kinds of people that were involved in this through discovery and process workshops. And through that, we were able to deliver a very good set of process and requirements documentation. It was, relatively, it was a big project because of the sheer magnitude of it. And the customer was extremely happy. They gave us a very high satisfaction rating, and we were happy. But our job kind of came to an end at this point. The same company was going to implement, but our team, we came to the end of job. So things got handed over to the development staff. And the development staff, it was their turn to start. And one of the first questions that came up is, so where are the requirements? And, I don't know, but this is how we did it on our last project. And started implementing the solution by going back and interviewing people again and trying to get some requirements and completely ignoring all the work that was done. I mean, it was a huge miss, right? But it was the time that a light bulb went on in my mind that says, this is crazy. It shouldn't work this way. There's got to be a better way. And if you sort of look at how this unfolded, it really documented or shone a light on this age-old disconnect between IT and the business. And this is not something new. We've talked about alignment of IT to the business, and that was a perfect misalignment where the business requirements somehow never got communicated adequately to the development folks. And they when they went to implement, ended up with serious cost overruns. They missed requirements and just really had a tough time with it. So another way of looking at that particular problem is, if you look at the first approach, the business worked at pulling together the process, the user stories, the requirements. But then there was this virtual brick wall, and we threw stuff over the brick wall, and it either wasn't understood well enough, maybe it wasn't good enough, but nobody told us that. But we threw it over the brick wall, and then the IT department or the development side of the house started doing process requirements and build. And you ended up with a project that took that long. The other approach is business and IT working together to do the process, the requirements, and build. And the bottom line is, when you have a dialogue that's actually driven from the process requirements to the user stories, to the technical requirements, to the implementation, you end up with faster deployments, better alignment with business objectives, and you can save a whole lot of time and money, not to mention frustration. So let's talk for a minute of how you can put some of this actually into practice. So I want to show you that same example of the process, the employee expense process, and how you can actually do some real mapping all the way down to the technical requirements. So let me go over here. So what I've gone ahead and done is I built my very simplistic employee expense approval process here in the Navvia Process Designer. So same process, the employee submits an expense form. In the manager swim lane, the manager either approves it or not, submits, and then the manager will submit it for payment. And then the finance department ultimately is responsible for reimbursing the employees. So if you take a look at any of these steps in the process, there's a number of details you can capture about that particular step. A description of the step, the roles that are involved in the step, any inputs required for this step, any outputs. And here you can see the actual user stories. So I've got two user stories here, one on completing the expense report and one of submitting the expense report. So if I take a look at this user story, submission of expense reports, we can see here, as an employee, I need a simple and time-saving method for capturing expenses and attaching receipts so that I'm paid in a timely manner. And the acceptance rate criteria says, ensure all relevant fields are on the form, ensure mandatory fields are honored, ensure expense report number is generated, whatever that acceptance criteria is. Again, this is just an example of it. And you can go on and capture multiple user stories for this particular step in the process, along with procedures for performing the step and any notes. So we're doing a business process mapping and user story developments. I wouldn't say simultaneously because it's an iterative approach. Once you get the business process defined as a business analyst, then the business analyst can meet with other folks to drill in a little bit deeper into these other items down to the user stories. And then from this representation of the process, you can automatically generate a number of specific artifacts. So I can go in and see, well, what does this process look like on a big picture from a SIPOC? And those of you who have any Lean Six Sigma training might be familiar with SIPOC. But what does this process look from a SIPOC perspective? Well, we've got the employee in the finance department as suppliers. We've got some inputs. We've got a process, which is submit, approve, and reimburse. We've got some outputs, which is the reimbursement check, and our customer is the employee. Or I can take a look at the various documents that are available. So one view of the document might be the employee expense process, user story, and requirements, where here I have automatically generated from the business process mapping tool, the user story documentation. So I can see in the table of contents, submission of expense report. So I can go in here. First of all, I can see what a user story is. Here's the following is a list of user stories. Here's a description, the acceptance criteria, the project that it's involved with, the epic, and the status. But we also went one step further and we mapped to that user story all the fields and requirements to support that particular user story. The employee, so in the task called employee submits expense form, we would need to know the employee name, a report number, receipt images. We maybe need to connect this application to single sign-on. We need a metric. So what's the cycle time for processing expenses? We might need an email notification. For example, this is to notify you that expense report number X has been submitted for approval. We need a wireframe mock-up of what the screen needs to look like. So these are all the detailed technical requirements. You can also produce from the same process. For example, if I just wanted an executive summary of the process document, from the same process definition, just extract different data, but it came from the same source. Now here's the employee expense process with a very different perspective. We have the description, the scope, the goal, the objectives, the roles, the RACI chart. We have process controls, policies, all the way down to the cross-functional flow diagram that shows how this process works. So various different views generated from the same business process analysis tool, ensuring there's tight alignment between business objectives and the resulting solution. And where you can drill down a little bit more is I can go down and then see all of the, and this is where the mapping occurs. Do I have user stories for every step in the process? And I can go in that particular user story, get additional detail about it, and then perform the mapping of the associated items. And I can associate a lot of different items, the task in the process, any data fields, any tool requirements, what state this process is in at this particular point for the workflow automation tool. What is the metric we're trying to measure here? What is the trigger that moves it from one state, for example, submitted? What are the email notifications? Down to a document that might, as I said before, demonstrate things like a wireframe. So availability of a tool that allows you to design the business process to meet the objectives, map its user stories, and drill all the way down to the technical requirements, producing seamless documentation right throughout the whole process. Now, this is also interesting because it can be delivered directly to specific tools through an API. Some of you might be familiar with a product called ServiceNow, which is a workflow automation platform for various processes, whether it's facilities management or IT management. And through an API, we could go out and explore that same environment from the process designer, find the employee expense process, and import into that tool the process documentation directly. So for example, if I wanted to bring in an executive summary of the process, be able to go out and generate the executive summary of the process and import it. Or I could go out and capture the technical design data for the process. And the technical design data are all your fields, your tool specs, trigger states, state transitions, documents, all of that sort of stuff. And even capture all the user stories and import those into the tool. And once imported into the tool, assigning it through the agile development module of this tool, like a Jira, very similar to a Jira if you're familiar with that, or Microsoft DevOps. So this actually creates user stories within the target platform so that the work can be generated. So now you have complete traceability from the business objectives through to the process, through to the user stories, through to the technical requirements, and delivered to a solution that allows you to assign those requirements out to people in form of epics, user stories, sprints, etc. There's a lot of other things that you can do within this environment. You can connect this information up a lot of different ways. But if I went to look at a user story, for example, let's see, I'm just looking for a specific so you can actually get down to the various user stories. If I went into the I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find a good user story here. My apologies. Let me just go back to the other one. So if I go down to the actual user story, I can see here the user story that was actually created within the business process management tool, transferred all of its data, including the description, the acceptance criteria, different fields about that particular project, including the project description, the priority, the status. And then here we have all of the specific details that are needed to support. So for example, I can see the various data fields like actual start date and get a full description of how that field needs to be implemented in the tool. So not only are these sort of the voice of the customer from the user story, but the detailed technical requirements you need to go ahead and implement. So what I was trying to talk about here today was the importance of really understanding the audience that you're building your solutions for so that you can build better products and better solutions. So some of the takeaways that I would just like to emphasize for today's session include that user stories are really an opportunity to open a dialogue and foster understanding. I can't stress that more. If you don't know the pain points of the people that you're trying to solve the problem for, how are you ever going to solve the problem? You really need to know what it is they're looking for, what's bothering them, what their frustrations are. You need to empathize with them so that you can really open up this dialogue, understand, and then define the problem you're trying to solve. These user stories help you empathize with the users so you can deliver superior products, ones that actually meet their needs, not the need of getting something out fast, but the need that will actually satisfy a particular user. User stories are integral to a variety of ways. They really relate to this concept of design thinking, where you're defining a problem, you're understanding the problem, where you're iterating and building out the solution, and when you're materializing it. But they're essential to all aspects of software development. It really gives you the foundation you need to build great solutions, superior products. User stories are not technical requirements. They were never intended to be technical requirements. As a user, I want a certain capability with the following benefit. User stories are not put this form on this screen. The technical requirements that support the user story define that, but the user story itself is really understanding the wants and the needs of the particular user community you're trying to solve. Remembering that there's many personas, right? There's a whole variety of people that you're trying to solve problems for, so you need to address the entire community. User story mapping allows you to break your stories down step by step in the flow. So whether you're following the process-driven approach or the user story mapping approach, it really all starts with understanding what the steps are. I submit that those have already been defined through business process mapping. And by tapping those people on the shoulder, you have a better chance of actually having alignment to the business processes. But user story mapping lets you break down the user's story steps by steps, by persona, by the level of detail. And this mapping really allows you to quickly identify gaps. Hey, we haven't addressed the sales force. We haven't addressed the nursing staff. You can quickly see from this human-centered approach where you have your gaps and where you have to spend some additional focus. Now, there's definitely a relationship now between business process mapping and user story mapping. So you can do it the way many organizations do, throw requirements over a brick wall and hope that the end solution comes out looking like it should, or you can do more of an iterative approach that starts with objectives, leads to the process, leads to the user stories, and then leads to the technical requirements. And lastly, I would submit that process-driven user stories really result in better IT and business alignment. They're going to result in far less waste, like my example with the bank technology rollout. A project that was this long could have been shortened, and that less waste is going to lower costs, save time, save money, reduce frustrations. So that's bringing us to the end, the formal end of the presentation. We'll stick around and take any questions and entertain any dialogue. If you want to learn more about process-driven user stories and the Navvia Process Designer, you can go to navvia.com/contact. Otherwise, we can stick around and have some and take some questions. So we got a couple of questions here. So how does the solution deal with version control? That's a very good question. So all processes are version controlled. The user stories can be updated, and the old user stories and the new user stories, the deltas between the user stories are captured in the audit log. So you have basically traceability from the initial user story all the way through to the end. Processes are version controlled and can actually be put through an approval cycle for feedback and approval. And then once transmitted across an API to a solution, if the user stories or process documentation is updated, there's a history log in the target technology as well, showing you that you have a new version of the particular. Now, once the user stories are across, most people tend to use their own management tools within the delivery technology to manage the stories in the queue, but everything that gets there is all version controlled. So we have a question here. What is the relationship between a task model and a user story role? It's a many-to-many relationship. That was an anonymous question that came in. So a user story may have many, a task may have many user stories. User stories can relate to different tasks. It's a many-to-many relationship. I'm just moving something out of the, their question came up as if there was an API to Jira. Soon, that is the actual next piece of the integration that we're working on. Now, the API that we have today is an open API. It's fully documented, and we basically expose the API to our customers. So for those, and others have used the API into tools that we don't have an official integration with, but I just want to say that Jira is next on the list, and it's probably, going to be out early next year. How would you map a user story to privacy requirements? This is coming in from William. I want to run a value-sensitive design for a user story and see what risks do I have and how to mitigate it, associate different stakeholders and their tensions, etc. Okay, going back to the process modeler, every task can have multiple roles. So you can actually produce RACI charts, and I didn't show that, but if I, oops, let me go back to the demonstration if it's still there. So I can go back and see very quickly. Let me use a process that has more data in it than the user story one. So let me go to this change management process. So this is a much more complex process with many more pieces associated with it. I can go into the documents reports, and I can see very quickly all of the roles that are involved in a task. And this role information is actually available, again, as part of the user story. So I can see that task one, whatever that task is, who are involved. So I see all the personas that are mapped to a particular task, and I see all the user stories that are mapped to a particular persona. So again, you get to see the whole picture. You know who you're affecting, you know what their role is. You even have documentation at a detailed level, for example, detailed information as to the responsibilities of the individual at these particular intersections of task and persona. So you get all the information you need to see who's involved and how the user stories are going to affect them. I hope that answered your question, William, and we'd be happy to follow up with you offline as well. Let's see, are there any other, there's no API yet for Easy Vista. Again, that's something we could add to our roadmap. As a matter of fact, I'll take a note here and make sure that I submit that as an enhancement request to the team. That's the first time I think I've heard of that one, but we can go ahead and do that. All right. Catherine, are there any other questions? I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, no, I think we respond and we answer all questions. I'm not sure if you can add something before we wrap up.
I'm sorry?
I'm not sure if you want to add something before we, okay, we have another question here.
Yes, yes, we do allow multiple people to work together. There's all kinds of different permissions you can secure. Who sees a process completely, who can edit a process, who can update a process, who can view a process. So there's a variety of security levels and permissions that are built into the tool. Again, we'd be happy to have a more deep dive presentation with anyone if you want to learn more about the product. And that sort of goes back to this slide that I had up. If you want to learn more, if you want to have a deep dive into the product, there's two ways. You can reach us at navvia.com/contact, but we will be sending out the presentation, the slides, and a link to this recording. And just respond to that email if you'd like to learn more, or if you have any additional questions. So in the interest of time, we are at the top of the hour pretty much. I want to thank you all so much for being part of today's webinar. It was really great to be able to do this. And I hope you guys got some value from it. And I want to wish you, there might be some other questions. No. And I want to just wish you a fabulous rest of your day. So thank you so much for attending, and bye for now. Take care.
Thank you, David. Thank you all.